Welcome to the conversation and Happy New Year. Delighted that you're with us for what I think is going to be certainly the best show of this year and maybe one of the best shows we do this whole year. Glad that my co-host, the Honorable Onjalé Scott Price, is with us. Happy New Year, Angie. Didn't get a chance to do that.
Yeah, Happy New Year, Rev.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And today's show is going to be on sport, particularly racism in sports. And we have just two incredible panelists for you today. Um, One is a legend, has been involved in addressing and dealing with issues of race and racism in sports for most of its entire life, which is now almost 8 decades. And the other is a young woman who is a former NCAA athlete and has also taken up the cause of promoting social justice in sports. But before we do that, we introduce you to them. Let's do as we always do. Let's go to our person on the street, someone you may be familiar with, and hear how she responds to the question of where is there racism in sports? Let's take a listen.
You have to kind of think that in some way it exists everywhere. And it's unfortunate. And obviously I'm speaking from a position of, a white female and haven't had, that direct experience, at least, being the target, I suppose, of racism or the, if not a target, at least a victim, I suppose. And so I think that racism is a really difficult topic because I think that the definition sometimes is considered black and white, and I think it's not. I think that there's a lot of racism that exists that people like myself, like anyone that wants to go through life as a good human, the thought of even having racist behaviors or racist thoughts is jarring and like very, very uncomfortable. And so I think that a lot of it is just, taking the time to really consider what it means, what racism means. And I think that, necessarily or not, having a particular thought or lack of thought, maybe, Alan, if that makes sense, is something that we have to consider. And I think that that it occurs at pretty much everywhere, I would imagine. I mean, my experience is obviously very limited in sport. I grew up playing all sorts of different sports, but my career has been in ice hockey, which is probably a slow sport in sort of evolving, I suppose, and becoming more educated in this area. So I think that we're seeing a lot of improvements. We're seeing more diversity on the ice in that way. And, hopefully as we continue to grow, we'll see more diversity at all levels. But I think that's just a very long-winded way of saying that, unfortunately, I think it probably exists everywhere in sports.
Well, folks, first of all, thanks to Colleen for getting us started with answering that question of, where is there racism in sports? Sports are such some people might say, a common denominator in our world. It's part of our social fabric. It certainly is big business. We all know about that. We hear about the multi-million-dollar contracts that some athletes, if they're professional, get, and coaches and the like. And so sports are not immune from racism. And so we've got two people who can help us continue to answer that question of where do you find racism in sports. And I want to welcome Jen Fry of Jen Fry Talks and Professor Richard Lapchick, who has spent much of his adult life working on this subject, and Jen is now doing the same thing. So, uh, Richard, if I can refer to you as that, I'd like you to offer your comments to get us started on where does racism exist in sports?
I think where we would say it has its biggest impact is on who leads the sports industry, both at the college level and the professional level. We've been doing what we call racial and gender report cards since the 1980s on each of the major men's professional sports, as well as the NWSL and the WNBA and the sports media. And there have been consistent increases in league offices in terms of hiring men, people of color and women. But the individual teams lag far behind them. And when you look at the, positions, everybody looks at head coach and general manager, and they're the most obvious public faces of a franchise. But there are, presidents and C-suite people and everybody else who makes those other decisions on the business side of sport that are equally important, and they are still overwhelmingly represented by white men. The worst of all the groups that we cover is the sports media, which is overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white. We're talking about 90% of the top sports executives in the media are white men, even in 2022 now. I think the changing factor, and what I hope will be the biggest dynamic to bring about change, is the number right behind you. When Colin Kaepernick took a knee in 2016, I think most of the American public opposed him. And when the Milwaukee Bucks refused to come out to play in the bubble in the NBA playoffs 2 years ago, a week after the shooting or shortly after the shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, people didn't criticize them. The NBA joined them and other leagues joined them. Suddenly we had athletes acting in unison with the power that they have and the influence they have, and also the resources they have. These are overwhelmingly wealthy people who can contribute those resources to social justice issues, and they have been. And they've also moved the leagues to put up significant amounts of money for social justice issues, particularly the NBA, Major League Baseball, and the NFL. Individual teams and other sports have done that. But I think we're at a time frame where, since the murder of George Floyd, the public is much more focused on these issues and systemic racism in general and all of its types of impacts that you've covered so well on your show up to now. And I think it's an opportunity that if we don't seize this opportunity, we're going to find ourselves back in the places where we were, sliding backwards instead of forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. You remind me that when Kaepernick took the knee, I was actually serving at a cathedral in Buffalo, New York, and Cap was in town the week after taking that knee and all the hoopla, playing the Buffalo Bills, and I tried to connect with him, but was unable to do so. Everybody, I guess, wanted to get to him at that point. And I went out and I bought this jersey that you see behind me. It's first and only NFL merchandise I've ever purchased. It cost me $100 though. But and I wore it that Sunday. And my goodness, people wanted to run me out of town. But I think there has been a sea change, and that people are not as critical. People are more accepting of the activism of athletes, and athlete activism goes back decades. And I'm going to come back to you, Professor Lapchick, in a moment, and have you share some of your experiences with that. But I want to toss it now to Jen Fry of Jen Fry Talks, and welcome you to the show, Jen. I guess I would say you're the newer generation of doing the work that Professor Lapchick has been involved in through the Sports Institute. And I know your firm, you are involved in social justice work using conversation like we're having today to educate and empower those within athletics through an anti-racist lens on issues of race, inclusion, intersectionality, diversity, and equity. So And give us your thoughts on that question. Where have you seen, and as a former NCAA athlete yourself, where have you seen racism in sports?
First of all, friends, I want to say I appreciate Onjalé, Will, homies. Thank you for having me here. I appreciate you taking the time to have me. Richard, I am citing you numerous times in my dissertation. So I want to thank you for all the baby, I'm citing you left and right, Richard. So thank you for all the gender report cards that you are giving me the information. It is appreciated. So I kind of come to you with two contexts. So my work with Gen Fry Talks is in the US context of race. My work with my dissertation is on the racial experiences of professional Black volleyball players in Europe. So I also have a pulse on what's happening with Black athletes in Europe across numerous sports. So that's kind of where I situate myself. So when you ask that question of where is racism in sport, I'm like, where is it not? Sport is a microcosm of society. Yes, we have Black people making millions of dollars. Yes, we have Black, white, Latinx people coexisting for a common goal. But literally, sport is just a microcosm of everyday things that we see. So the reality is I ask, where do we not see it? I think what we've seen with sport is because these people are going towards a common goal, it's like, well, then racism doesn't exist here. We see these people, these Black people, they're making $1 million contracts. How can there be racism? And then I'll point the book of my committee member, the amazing Dr. Billy Hawkins, talking about the new plantation, right? And so I think that what we need to do is we need to actually look at racism in a different mindset and say, how is it manifesting in sport? Where is it manifesting in sport? If we look at the European context, people are still being called the N-word, things are being said. Within the US context, things are still being said. What we see now is that people are accepting athletes protesting to a certain level, only to a certain level. If you start talking about white people and whiteness, we are seeing it immediately stopped, right? They are okay in sport with talking to Black people and brown people about race. They are not okay with talking to GMs and presidents and white people about racism. They are not. And so that's where I think it's like, yes, we can talk about this, we can do these things, but to a certain point. If we remember the first football game with the Chiefs and someone else where both teams kneeled for racism, what happened? Everyone was booing. So they're okay with athletes protesting to a point, to a comfortable point for them, not where they have to turn the mirror back and reflect on themselves. Well, I think because you come from the church, right? It is okay for white preachers and pastors to talk about racism to Black churches. It is not okay for them to talk to their own white churches. So you see reverends and pastors and preachers all getting the pushback when they talk to their white congregations about whiteness. So I think we really need to understand that racism is just a microcosm. How it shows up in sport is just a microcosm of society. We have to know that all these sports are being super reactive. They get hit by a bus and they're like, what do I do now? So they're reactive. We have to look, my great friend Jen Hunter, who works for the Trailblazers, every 2 years, there is a flashpoint. George Floyd, Me Too movement. We saw the LGBT movement. So every 2 years, there's a flashpoint. And the last things that I'll leave you with is that MLK, when he was preaching, he had a 33% approval rate, right? When he was, everyone hated MLK. Newsflash, they assassinated him. Everyone hated him, but he was whitewashed to be the figment of social justice. When Colin Kaepernick kneeled, 33% approval rating. Everyone hated him. We had that flashpoint. Now he is the beacon of social justice. So I think it's just a very reactive movement. But like what Richard said, if we don't clasp onto this and use this flashpoint, this reactive movement to push things forward, we'll just come back to a halt.
All I got to say is amen to that. Oh, my goodness. Thank you. Thank you, Jen. Wow, so much going through me right now that I want to say that I'm feeling. So thank you for that. Thank you. But I want to get Angie in on the conversation. But one of the things that was going through my mind was you, Jen, talking about using Richard Lapchick as a primary resource for your work on your dissertation. May you be blessed in that work and it come to fruition. Um, and you talk about the moments in history when there is a response, right? Like, yeah, I think you said like every 2 years there's a flashpoint and there's a response. And then we go back to where we were. And that reminds me again of the work that you've done, Richard, for almost 8 decades now, I guess, or at least 7 decades on this. And I know you've done a lot of work with a lot of different athletes and organizations. I thought maybe we would share now with our audience the video biography that ESPN did on you, because I think that does set the story, sets the context for the work you've been involved in so much of your life. So let's take a look now at that brief video on the biography of Richard Lapchick.
Richard grew up in a family where there was a strong tradition of doing the right thing. His father was an iconic figure. He signed Sweetwater Clifton to the Knicks, breaking the color barrier.
His recollections alone of being around his father growing up would fill a dinner table conversation with great tales, meeting Jackie Robinson when he was a kid, seeing what his father went through for fielding the first black player in Knick history.
Joe was someone who, as a coach, never let race get in the way of doing the right thing. And there's no question that had a huge impact on Richard himself.
When I was 14, I was at a basketball camp with 5 other white guys. One of the white guys was hurling the N-word at the black guy day in and day out till I challenged him, and this guy had knocked me out cold. Well, the black guy was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lou Alcindor, and a lifelong friendship grew out of that.
Everything Richard has fought for has not been popular at the time. And he has been this courageous light that has said, this needs to be said, this needs to be heard, and I'm gonna say it.
There's a fine line sometimes between being courageous and putting your life on the line. With progress comes pain. And that was a price that he was willing to pay.
When I was the American leader of the sports boycott of South Africa, I was actually attacked in my office in a college library by 2 masked men and had the N-word carved in my stomach.
Richard had very bravely spoken out against apartheid. There were risks involved. There were just a lot of bigots who didn't like what he had to say.
He was attacked for standing up and wanting to right a wrong. And to be brutally attacked as he was, to have the N-word carved with scissors into his stomach, he had to have been frightened beyond words. And a lesser person would have said, okay, that's it, I'm done. Not Rich. They who did that, it's the wrong person.
I've been involved in civil rights for the last 28 years of my life, but I can never, ever, ever know what it's like to be black. That's an instantaneous, every minute sentence that society has given to black communities and Hispanic communities in this country, that discrimination can take place at any time.
My dad taught me that a leader is somebody who stands up for justice and doesn't block its path. I've spent most of my adult life trying to help young people who live in crises that have become more profound as the generations have gone on.
You know, he's really been in the forefront in the whole bridge between sports and using that to achieve equality, not only here in the United States, but around the world.
He's been involved in civil rights and race issues for his entire life.
I automatically smile when I think of Richard. Wow. I smile and also a tear comes to my eyes. Whew. He's a good man. I thank him. I'm appreciative of the work that he has done. Thank you. Thank you, Richard Lapchick. Thank you for being you, and thank you for wanting this world to be a better place, and because of you, it is.
Wow. You know, folks, I have been a fan of Richard Lapchick's for decades, as long as he's been doing this work. And I'm a former athlete, and so I appreciate the work that he's been doing and the social activism work in which he's been engaged. And so I just want to say, Richard, to you, thank you. Thank you for the work you're doing and for inspiring people like Jen Fry to continue the work that you're doing. So tell us what you're thinking and feeling about this subject right now.
Well, just to comment on the video a little bit, because I think so I do a lot of speaking, maybe 75 or 80 presentations a year, and I know that there are people in the audience when they first see this older white guy get up there, how is this guy going to talk to us about diversity and inclusion or racism? And just to go back a little bit deeper into the video, literally when I was a 5-year-old boy, I looked outside my bedroom window in Yonkers, New York, where I was raised, and saw my father's image swinging from a tree with people under the tree picketing. And for several years after that, I'd pick up the extension phone in our house, my dad not knowing I was listening, and it was racial epithet after racial epithet being hurled at him. As a 5, 6, and 7-year-old kid, I had no idea what that meant, except a lot of people hated the man who was my best friend. And I would only later understand that, as you saw in the video, as the coach of the Knicks, he signed the first Black player in the history of the NBA, a league that's now 80% Black. But when the first Black players were signed, there was a ton of resistance to it, and my dad became the object of that. So my dad is also a double inductee into the Basketball Hall of Fame as a player with the original Celtics and as a coach with the Knicks and St. John's. And he was, everybody told me I was going to play in the NBA. Well, as a 12, 13, 14-year-old kid, I liked that idea. So I wanted to work on my game. I was recruited. I was 6 feet tall in the 8th grade. So I was one of the tallest players in New York City. And I was recruited by a school called Power Memorial. I didn't go there, became friends with the coach, as you saw in the video. I ended up at his summer camp the next year. And, the net result is I define a leader as somebody who stands up for justice and doesn't block its path. The first time I actually stood up for it was in that summer camp, as you saw in the video, when I challenged this white guy dropping the N-word on who turned out to be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and a lifelong friendship began. And, it's so enduring that when Kareem got the Presidential Medal of Freedom at the end of Barack Obama's administration, I was his guest along with Henry Louis Gates at that. He asked me to speak at the Staples Center when his statue was unveiled. He came and was a commencement speaker here at the University of Central Florida, where I work. But as a 15-year-old white kid, the importance of that friendship was I suddenly had a young urban African-American lens to see what racism was doing to his community and other communities of color, and decided at that moment that I was going to spend the rest of my life working on the area of civil rights. I didn't know what it meant as a 15-year-old, but I knew that's what I wanted to do. I ended up getting my doctorate in international race relations. It was the first one in the country in a newly emerging field then in the late 60s. And I did my dissertation on how South Africa used sport as part of its foreign policy and the international response, compared to how the Nazis had done that in the 1930s. And I started teaching at a college in Virginia in 1970. And as you saw in the video, the first South African team was coming to the United States. It was a Davis Cup team in 1978. I went down to Nashville, where the matches were supposed to take place, to try to get them stopped. And the African governments with whom I was working closely asked me to announce they would boycott the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games if the team was allowed to come. So all 3 networks at the time, the networks, were there to cover the press conference. And Dick Schaap came up to me afterwards. You saw his son Jeremy in the video. Dick was probably the top sports broadcaster of that era. And he said that the financial backers of the Davis Cup had pulled out. It looked like the matches were going to be canceled. I announced that to the crowd. It was an anti-apartheid crowd. They went crazy. And when I flew home to Virginia that night, I thought maybe for the first time in my life, I had done something worthwhile. The next night, as you heard in the video, I was working late in my college office. Office was in the school's library. Library closed at 10:30, 10:45. There's a knock on the door. I didn't hesitate to open it because normally the campus police would check if they saw a light on after the building was shut. So when I opened the door, instead of the campus police, it was 2 men wearing stocking masks who proceeded to cause liver damage, kidney damage, a hernia, concussion. carved the N-word in my stomach with a pair of office scissors. And as I lay in the hospital bed that night, I thought that if people had gone to the length they did to try to stop my father 28 years before, and the length they tried to go to stop me that night, they must have thought that using the sports platform to address racism was an effective tool that they wanted to stop. So I decided that night that I was going to spend the rest of my life using that sports platform to do that. And that's essentially what I've done on racial issues, on gender issues, on LGBTQ and other issues that have become important over time. And I usually don't tell this part of the story, but because of what's happened in the last 2 years, I will share it. So I was in the hospital for 4 days, and I came home on a Friday morning. About 25 friends and supporters had come in from around the country to support me. And a friend from Nashville called in the afternoon and said that the Nashville Banner, which was the afternoon newspaper, had run a page one story across the banner headline that said Lapchick's wounds ruled self-inflicted. And it was attributed to a local police, unnamed police reporter, that they thought that I had self-inflicted these wounds. One of the people in our living room was an attorney who was a neighbor. And he said, we better go down and talk to the police, which we did the next day. The detective in charge of the investigation said, listen, I believe the attack took place the way you said it did, but there are people in the force who think you did this to yourself. Why don't you take a lie detector to prove that the attack took place the way you said it did? As a student of the civil rights movement, I knew how lie detectors were used against civil rights activists in the past by police. So I said it was unlikely that I would do it. But I told them that I would speak to all the leaders in our coalition, and all the major civil rights leaders were in it. And if they thought I should take it to get us back on track with South Africa, that then I would agree. Spoke to them all that night. They all to a person said absolutely not, to refuse. The detective had said, when my friend, the attorney, said, well, what's going to happen with the information that you've asked him to take a lie detector? He said, nobody will know until he says yes or no, then we'll have to make it public. I thought that was probably a logical thing as a naive 33-year-old or whatever I was at the time. And the next morning at 8:30, a local reporter called saying, we understand you've been asked to take a lie detector. What are you going to do? So I explained that to him. He wrote the story the next morning. You can imagine in a Southern newspaper, an accusation like this resonated very negatively in terms of me. It was a pretty horrifying several moments, which were amplified by the fact that the story quoted a medical examiner who had come to visit me in the hospital. The police told me that they were sending me their doctor. The term medical examiner never came up, to make sure I was okay. He came into the room. He happened to be from India, and he talked about his support for me and my work in the civil rights and anti-apartheid movements. He literally never looked at 1 inch of my body. But the next day, as part of that story, he was saying, after a thorough examination of Lapchick, I believe that all the wounds I saw were consistent with self-infliction. So as I'm sure your audience has seen in the wake of everything that's happened in the past 2 years, every family that was impacted since the murder of George Floyd, including the family of George Floyd, hired a private medical examiner to come in and examine the bodies of their loved one. Because a study came out during this period of time that 85% of medical examiners who were surveyed said that they had changed their opinion on the death of whoever it was they were examining to conform with the police's decision. I ended up having to go to New York. I took a lie detector privately. I had a civil rights medical examiner examine. We released the results of those tests at a press conference at the United Nations. And as I flew back to Virginia, after the press conference, the rumor was that I was going to be arrested upon arriving back in Virginia. But I guess they had heard the news that I had taken the lie detector and had the New York medical examiner, civil rights medical examiner, say that the attack took place the way I said it did. So, those things have all formed my opinions of racism in America and globally, but also my commitment to wanting to spend the rest of my life working on anti-racist issues. And I just recently announced about a month and a half ago that I was stepping down as the chair of the DeVos Sport Business Management Program to work solely on anti-racist issues in my remaining years, whatever they may be. I'm 76 now. I must admit that I was feeling somewhat old until somebody who was 78 became a first-term president, and suddenly 76 sounded a little bit okay. So anyway, that's a little bit of background to the video, and I appreciate your asking that question. I hope I didn't go too far on it.
That's heavy. Wow.
But I consider myself blessed that all that happened at this stage. I lived. I didn't have any long-term damage, and I think it helped eventually to amplify my voice. And it was at a time in the movement that the Black community, civil rights community, was wanting to work strictly in the Black community and wanted white people to work in the white community. And I became kind of a bridge in the late 70s and early 1980s for that because of what happened to me. So, I, as I said, accepted that as a blessing with hindsight.
That's amazing. Quite often, Reverend will say, we don't need any more allies, we need accomplices in the work that we're doing. And I'm going to say that Professor Lapchick is an accomplice, and we need more accomplices like him in the work that we do. That's incredible. And I really applaud you for saying that you're going to continue this work for the rest of your life and not retire. One thing that the rest of us on the show don't have the pleasure of is never not being who we are. We never have the chance to not do anti-racist work because we're going to wake up Black every day for the rest of our lives. And so it's really meaningful when we have accomplices who are willing to do the work right along with us and never necessarily put the torch down. So I want to express my sincere gratitude because, as you said, sports aren't always, if ever, looked at as being part of our microcosm of racism that we have. I know when we first were discussing this idea for the show, it's like, yeah, I'm sure there's somewhere we can find racism in sports to talk about. But then, of course, as we started talking about it, it's like, oh yeah, it's everywhere. It's in everything. And I can think of examples of growing up, all my Black friends being pushed to go get sports scholarships instead of education scholarships. It's just a small idea compared to some of the bigger things we've been talking about. I'm really interested in hearing from Jen about the research that she's doing for her dissertation and how the work that Dr. Lapchick has done is informing what you're working on.
Yeah, I think athletics is all about data and stats. That's all it is. And the gender and equity report cards are that's all it is. It's full of data. So it's really hard sometimes when things are going on, you just don't have the data. Or it's really old data. And the one thing is that all the report cards come out every year. So you even see like this lineage of intense data. And so that's tremendously helped me out. Like I said, I have a European context, but so my research, I'm in geography. I will probably be the first ever Black female sport geographer in the world. Sport geography as a academic discipline doesn't really exist. There's no colleges, no universities that have it as a major, as a minor, as a graduate level. It just doesn't exist, which is wild because sport is our whole lives. You would think there's more about sport geography. And so for me to be able to situate people for volleyball in a European context, I first have to situate them within a US context of giving them the data on coaches, on athletes, all of those type of things. So that's a part that's really helped me, is be able to have the data to situate people in sport geography on a US context to then be able to have the dotted line to a European context. It's always interesting in geography because people look at it as like plants and dirt and sand dunes. And geography is really about people and movements and place and space. And, my goal is to get people thinking more about place and space on a more intense level than they do now, because both of them, they coincide very well, but they're separate entities. And the more we understand place and space from a geographical lens, the more we can understand the covert experiences of athletes, because everyone knows the overt experiences, right? Everyone knows you being yelled the N-word. Okay, we know that. But what people don't think about is a hostile space that, while it's not overt, Black and brown people, we can feel that hostility. A word doesn't have to be said to us, but we can feel it with the people who are around us, if we're welcome, if we're not welcome. And we're just talking about space in relation to people. If we talk about place, I had my dissertation proposal in December, and I used one of the parts from the Colin Kaepernick video where it's when he's at the hotel and the white guy is coming out of the elevator and is like, "You okay?" talking to his parents, and Colin's like, "Yeah, I'm good." And that's an example of those hotels were hostile places. His parents experienced it on a very different level than him. And because they weren't aware of the hostility of place, they didn't even see it. It did not exist to them. That elevator scene, it was so far above their heads. It was on the 9th floor. And so really for me, when I look at race, especially from a European and then also US, I look at place and space and how they're violent and hostile to Black and brown athletes, regardless if they're millionaires, right? We've seen LeBron's house being spray painted. We saw the basketball player held down by the police. Like regardless of you making millions, we see that place and space can still be very hostile to them, regardless of their celebrity status.
I might actually read your dissertation when you're done. So please send it to me because that sounds really interesting. That sounds really cool. I really like the idea of the geography piece to it because that's not something that we often think about. Like I'm from Southern California, just outside Los Angeles, and now I live in Falmouth, and they're very different places for different reasons, demographics, type of city or town. And it's just interesting to think about how I feel in some of the spaces back home, not just because they're home, but because who's there and the spaces that are created there versus some spaces here. So that sounds really cool. I didn't know that, like you said, that was a thing that you could work on, but I'm glad you're doing it.
So I'll give you an example of place and space that can maybe help you remember. So I coached at Illinois in 2011. We played for a national championship against UCLA. I hate UCLA with every bone in my body. I will always hate, when you beat me in a national championship, I hate you. Like I can't, I have my runner-up trophy here, but I want it to be a national championship trophy, right? Just gonna say that.
That's fair.
And so the game was at the Alamo Dome in San Antonio. And so if you're watching the game, say when we were playing USC, we played USC, we beat them in 5. So you see it, the place can be very different for two people. The USC fans are sitting there like this. The Illinois fans, right? So you experience place completely different from other people. We are literally sitting next to each other. I'm experiencing place as cheering, and my USC friend is experiencing it as being pissed off because they're losing. So thinking about if you just watch a game and you will be able to construct an understanding of place and how it's experienced differently by different people. Because so many times people don't understand, everyone experiences things differently. And people can't get their head around it. I could be standing right next to someone. I can be standing right next to my white best friend, and we will drastically have different experiences because of where we're at, how she might be accepted, and how I might be excluded.
Yeah, it's like I've told this story on this show before, how I came home one night from a meeting at about 10:30, and the fire trucks were in the driveway here at the parish, and so I obviously got concerned. I got out and walked over to speak to one of the firefighters, and I said, what's going on? And he's like, "Oh, I'm glad you're here." He says, "You're the caretaker, right?" And I was like, I take care of the souls of the people here. That's what I do. So I'm going to shift this for a moment. But so much is coming to me. Can we do a 2-hour show? I mean, this is good stuff. So as I said, I was an athlete, not really good. I was average. Did have a chance for a college football scholarship, but then I blew out my knee, and that was the end of that story. But I played soccer at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and on the freshman team, and so I've been around sports and have sons that played sports and all. And so we've all had experiences with racism. My oldest son was trying to become a professional baseball umpire and ran into all kinds of problems making it through the minor leagues and stuff because of race. And nobody cares about officials, but this is something Jen and Richard that I fought for many years. I'm also a former, I guess I should say, retired basketball and football official. I refereed college and high school football and high school basketball. And the racism that even exists in the ranks of the officials. You know, I wrote so many letters to the New York Times, the USA Today, you know, several years ago, when every time I turned on the TV, all the officials, all the referees in a basketball game, for instance, were white, and all the players are black. And sometimes you might have two black coaches, head coaches, and all the players are black, but the three officials are all white. And I was like, doesn't anybody else see this? Why is that the case? And you know, I remember trying to make it through the ranks, climb up the ranks through officiating, and the racism that I ran into there. So, yeah, it permeates every aspect of the sport. So let's do this. Let's take a listen to Colleen and see how she responds to the second question, which I'm going to ask you two to respond to as well, and that is, so what do we do about it? What can we do? How do we go about eliminating racism in sports? So Colleen's going to give us some ideas, and then I want to come back and we'll start with you, Richard, to find out how Jen and you feel what we can do to eliminate racism in sports.
You know, so much of it is representation and having conversations like this. You know, like one thing that I always think about, there's this cool organization called Black Girl Hockey Club, and they're obviously trying to get more Black girls involved in the sport of hockey. It's a great sport. It's a great sport for everyone, and they're looking to increase representation. You know, and I love that organization. I love that initiative, and a lot of it, you know, boils down to, you know, how do we eliminate sexism in sports? Like, you know, so that's something that I can more closely relate to, right? And just taking my experience as a woman in a male-dominated sport, and, you know, what does that feel like, and what does that look like from time to time, and what are the points of frustration, and, you know, how do we get around that? And I think that, you know, again, we're making progress on that front, and I think that, you know, we need to have that same type of movement in terms of diversity and race. I started to say that one of the things that I remember, so when I played in 98, like, you know, we played pretty much in anonymity, like nobody really knew who we were until the Olympics, right? Like, and then our team got a ton of coverage, and, you know, we won, and that helped. And then all of a sudden, you know, more girls were signing up to play hockey. And I don't remember where it was, but I remember the feeling I had walking into a rink, and there was like a youth girls like tournament happening, and like just seeing like so many young girls playing hockey. They all had their jackets and their matching sticks, and they're hanging out with their teams. And I really kind of had an emotional response to that, because I was like, wow, that's nothing I ever had. And I probably didn't even know that I missed it until I saw all these little girls having that experience. And so when I think about organizations like Black Girl Hockey Club and others out there, that's just one I'm familiar with, you know, like they deserve to have that feeling too, right? They deserve to be able to like walk into a rink somewhere or any sports venue and have that feeling that says, wow, like, look at how much better things are. And obviously it's never, I shouldn't say never, it's not perfect. It's going to take a long time for it to be perfect if we get there. But just seeing that progress and seeing that representation, you know, the feeling that I had, I just feel like these other, you know, groups deserve to have that feeling as well.
Hey, Colleen, thank you again for getting us started with answering that question. You know, how do we eliminate racism in sports? And I guess it's probably a question, how do we eliminate racism, period? But today our focus is on sports, and we're joined once again by Richard Lapchick, who's devoted his life to this work and continues to do anti-racism work and anti-trafficking work, and is involved in so much. Make sure you go online and Google Richard Lapchick, all right? And you'll be glad you did. And so grateful to have Jen Fry with us. Jen is a fireball who is also working on her doctorate, her dissertation, and has been a NCAA athlete and is now committed to addressing social injustices as they find themselves in sports. So, Richard, we'll start with you. How do we change it? How do we get rid of racism in sports?
Well, it's not going to change by itself. People like me who are in power, who look like me, aren't going to cede that power. It's going to take pressure. We've been applying pressure a long time, and it's been effective to some degree. But I think the new element that we have that is going to increase the possibilities in sport specifically, but also to some degree in society, is the athlete activism. When athletes turn their attention to front offices of teams and say, let me see who you're interviewing, let me see who's hired in each of the significant positions, athletic departments, coaching fraternities and sororities, who's being interviewed and who's being hired. I think it's at that point that we're going to start to see those numbers change finally. Last year, again, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and everything that's happened since, more than half of the men's basketball coaches in college sport that were hired in Division I were Black, a totally unprecedented situation. Same percentage of women, Black women, were hired as head coaches in women's basketball. We were talking about a sport that had its lowest number of college basketball, that is, lowest number of Black head coaches at any time since 2006 going into last year. That's 16 years after 2006. We're going backward, not forward. But again, the focus is here. And I think when we get athletes to shape that and form that point of pressure to this issue, that those numbers are going to change, that they're not going to accept the type of treatment that they see in Black communities and brown communities around the country beyond the arenas. So many of our arenas are in Black neighborhoods where those athletes have an even more amplified voice. For me, this all started to change with the death of Muhammad Ali. I was lucky enough to be friends with Muhammad and Lonnie from the late 70s on. I was in Louisville the day of the funeral. Those athletes around the country who I don't think really probably knew, because very few people have a sense of history these days, about the extent of his activism, about all the things he did, but suddenly they're reading about it in the obituaries and the stories being written in the broadcasts on television about how consistent he was over decades. And to see that he had gone from what I would argue was probably the most unpopular person in the country in the late 1960s to, I would argue, maybe the most popular person in the country at the time of his death, and athletes seeing that as a possibility for them to, maybe I can speak out. Then those 4 great NBA players on the ESPYs went on and talked about police brutality and systemic racism at the beginning of the ESPYs and took on that courageous stand. And I think they saw the applause that they got. It was in that context that Kaepernick took the knee and began what's now evolved into this very powerful movement. And I think that, I was thrilled last year when the NBA created the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar Social Justice Champion Award named after Kareem and gave it to Carmelo Anthony as the first recipient. And they're acknowledging not only, stats from a ball game, but stats from the impact people are having in communities. And I think this is a hopeful sign at a time that, as Jen reiterated, we've got to seize this moment and not let the moment pass, because we might not get this opportunity again.
Can I ask a follow-up question before I kind of want to ask a similar question to Jen? So Dr. Lapchick, when you're doing the social justice work that you're doing and you're talking to people, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you say to other white folks about this issue. And I ask that because the Falmouth community, who was most of the people who watch this show, we're something like 94% white. And so we do have quite a few allies and accomplices and people who do know that there are issues, but there's definitely still people who think because we have athletes who make millions of dollars, like there's no racism, or because we have Black head coaches. So what do you say to those people, and what kind of conversations do you have with other white folks that there really is an issue and here's what you can do about it?
Well, you kind of laid out this perspective earlier in your commentary, but I didn't say that back in 1978, when the attack happened and other things happened to me after that, that a lot of people came up to me and said, well, now you know what it's like to be Black. And my response to them then and my response to them today would be, I don't know what it's like to be Black. I can walk away from this at any moment and live whatever a normal life would mean in a suburban white community and have a comfortable lifestyle and never face discrimination or violence again. If I'm Black, I'm going to wake up Black the next day and face that possibility every day of my life. Hopefully it'll never happen, but it's always possible that it could happen to you. I can't understand as a white person, nor can you, if I'm talking to that white audience, what it's like to be Black. And I think that, I think we've all heard commentary coming from Black leaders this year that in the past couple of years, that they think white people are listening more than they were in the past. And that's my experience in the audiences I've been involved with over the past year and a half since the murder of George Floyd, that whereas white people might say, well, yeah, racism is bad, but they could see what it's actually doing to individual people and the toll it's taking on their daily and long-term lives, that it's not something that can be passed over. I think white people are finally getting that. And if I'm talking to a white audience, I would be saying we all have to get that. I would say that, everybody can't be on the front lines, but everybody's got to get off the sidelines in this battle to fight against systemic racism.
I really like that. Not everybody has to be on the front lines, but everybody's got to get off the sidelines. I'm gonna write that down somewhere. I like that a lot. So if I could, well, Jen, I want to open it up for you to respond to the question in general. I'm also hoping you could talk a little bit about, especially with the work that you do, I would say overseas, because we're in America, in Europe. In my experience talking to European people, they think that most racism is an American problem. So I'm kind of curious about what it's like for you to talk to people in Europe about this issue, or in the European context.
So do you want me to answer the first question that you asked? How would you like
Sorry, just any part of that in any context that you feel is appropriate, or that you'd like to answer. It also in context, I guess, of what do we do in general about the issue.
So I think a few things that we have to do is the first thing is we have to acknowledge history, and that history has many viewpoints. Right now, history is viewed through a white lens of what happened. And as we see with the 1619 project with Nicole Hannah-Jones, that if you mention it from a Black lens, it's not a real thing. So I think we have to peel off the layer that history is objective, and there's no objective. Nothing in the world is objective. Everything is subjective, and everything has a lens. So I think the first thing, if we're going to eradicate this thing, is we have to really be willing to take a look at all the ugly parts of history. I think the second part is we have to stop romanticizing sport. Sport is so romanticized as people come together. So there's no racism because a white person and a Black person are doing these things. No, we have to stop romanticizing and saying it's just a microcosm. It's a complete microcosm, because who's in power? White people. Who are doing majority of the work? Black and brown people. If we look at the NFL is 69.7% Black. You want to know how to stop racism in the NFL? Black athletes stop playing. If they say we're not going to play until these things are done, baby, when we're talking about money, we saw what COVID did to money. If they said we're not playing in the Super Bowl unless these things are done, guess what's going to start happening? So when athletes really start to get together and say, we are not going to accept this, we are not going to play, then things will happen. The NBA is 80% white. Same thing. We saw with the Bucks. When they say they're going to stop playing, things will happen. So I think this whole thing of really coming together so that we can say, this is what we're not going to accept. I think the next thing, that kind of what you were talking about, Will, about who is coaching, who is not coaching. I think we have to pay attention to how coaching funnels and officiating funnels happen. We just read an article on nepotism in the NFL. It's like 80% nepotism in the NFL. Like, it's their brothers, brother-in-laws, son-in-laws. Those are who's getting the jobs. So we have to pay attention to these coaching funnels. Dr. Moore of Texas wrote this great article about who are the walk-on athletes. The walk-on athletes are white males. especially in basketball. And what are they doing as walk-ons? They're not looking at their experience as I'm playing. No, they're looking at their experience as this is going to help me get a coaching job. This is going to help me become an assistant. This is going to help me become a head coach. And so where are the Black athletes who are taking advantage of those opportunities as well to get into coaching? I was a volleyball official for 10 years. So I understand what you're talking about. What are the officiating funnels? We are not giving Black athletes options. We are not saying, well, yeah, you might go to NFL or NBA, but what about coaching for you? What about officiating for you? What about? We don't give a multitude of opportunities like we do with white males. I think also second chances. Black coaches do not get second chances. The second chance they get is to be the janitor. I have seen so many white males fired up. Can we talk about Kingsbury from Arizona Cardinals? How do you get fired from a college job and get a pro job? Richard, I need to see fired up data. How do you get fired from a college job and you get a head pro job? Second chances don't happen to Black athletes. We saw the head coach who was at Indiana, Black female basketball coach. She got fired. She couldn't get an assistant job. She ended up at Buffalo, took him to the Sweet 16. Black coaches don't get second jobs. They don't even really get a first job as a Black coach. You have to have a scroll of experience. The head football coach at the Texans, Black male, he has 30 years of experience. The head coach of the Rams, he got 3-5 years of coaching experience as the head pro coach. So I think those are the small things that we have to look at where racism is showing up, is who is in power? How are they able to stay in power? How are they able to get their friends and family to keep in power? Because there was an article that showed that a white team versus a historically Black team, the officials called more fouls on historically Black teams. So it's happening with fouls, it's happening at every aspect. And then the second question you had, Onjalé, about how do we talk to white people? I think we have to totally deconstruct our definition of racism. Right now, racism is 1960s racism, you N-word and all that. We're not looking at it as a system. And so we have to talk about it as a system in which one race maintains supremacy over another through a set of attitudes, behaviors, social structure, and institutional power. We have got to talk to them about racism in a totally different, disaggregated way. We can't talk about it as I don't like you because of the color of your skin. The way we need to talk about it is I love you, but you have to straighten your hair. I'm going to call you a nickname. I'm not going to call you Onjalé. I'm going to call you Sarah because that's just too hard to say. So I'm just going to call you Sarah. And can you please straighten your hair? Because I really like curly hair, but it just looks a little unkept. And Will, I like talking to you, but you're a little aggressive with your tone. So it's kind of scaring me. And now Will gets fired. So we need to talk about those social structures and institutional power to white people. It ain't about you not liking me. I don't care if you got Black friends, Black sisters, Black brothers. It is how do you treat people of color and Black people in all these situations where you're not going to be seen? Who are you promoting? Who are you firing? Who are you disciplining? And what are the reasons you're doing that? That is what we need to do. And lastly, we need to talk about shame and guilt. People of Will and Richard, your background, your age bracket, if you talked about race, you're the racist. If you can't talk about at the kitchen table, what was it, sex, race, and religion? What were the three things that you weren't allowed to? And so now we're growing up that we have shame or guilt if we're talking about these huge identity things. So we have got to acknowledge the shame and guilt and start talking about it and teaching kids. Because y'all, the student athletes, they know, they get it. It's who is putting the stop on the conversations are older people. So how do we have conversations with the people putting the stop and allow the younger people to just keep going and elevate them?
You're right, Will. This is definitely going to be the highlight of the year because I am excited. I am empowered. This is amazing. But I'm going to stop talking. I'll pass it to you, Rev.
Well, we've been wanting to do this show for a while. We've been talking about doing this show for, 4 or 5 months, and so glad we had a chance to do it. And here we are. We in bowl season, college bowl season, about to have the championship game. Super Bowl's not far away. I will tell you that I boycotted the NFL for 4 seasons. I just this season started back watching NFL because of the way they treated Cap. You know, I was like, yeah, I can't do anything else, maybe, but I ain't watching that. I am not going to be a patron of that league. Now, uh, Jen, you gave Richard some homework to do to get some data on the coaches. I want somebody to do some homework on officials. You know, my eyes do not deceive me. I can't believe it when probably tonight, when I turn on an NBA basketball game, I'm going to see all black players on the floor, or mostly black players, black head coaches, and every doggone official is going to be white. To me, why is that? Well, officials are like the overseers. You know, they're overseeing the guys on the plantation, right? Keeping them, in check, making sure they following the rules. I have been in locker rooms where I've heard officials talk about how they're going to stick it to a player, usually black, because they just didn't like his attitude or what have you. Racism, it just permeates so much of sports. So somebody please do some research on officials, because we got some folks out there who are really good, who will be great for the game. I compliment the NBA. I don't know if it was because I wrote letters to them for about 10 years saying you guys need to get more black officials on the court. But we do see more and more black officials on the courts now. But we need to see even. I don't think we should ever turn on an NBA game or an NFL game and not see the majority of the officials be black folks. I mean, come on. Jen, you're right. We got to stop romanticizing it. One of the things that upsets me the most every year is when the NFL draft comes on, and to me, I got in trouble when I was on Facebook. I don't do social media anymore, but I used to say, okay, here comes the annual slave trade. Here's the annual slave trade. We put these black athletes, through an examination, checking their teeth, checking their muscles, checking their weight, checking their height and their hair, giving them tests to see what their IQs are and stuff. I mean, to me, it's just a modern day slave trade. And I'm grateful for the ones that have a chance to get drafted and to make the money to provide for their families and all. But man, that's just a perpetuation in my mind of racism. So, and Jen, you're right about black coaches not getting second chances. I've been watching the games. There's Todd Bowles on the sidelines, used to be head coach in New York. There's Leslie Frazier, used to be head coach in Minnesota, on the sidelines. They can't get a second chance. Can't get a second chance, right? And in the meantime, coaches with no experience, boom, right to the top. So I'll stop preaching and give the last few minutes of the show to our phenomenal guest today. Richard, any closing comments you'd like to make?
Well, just as a point of reference, we do have this data on the officials in each of our racial and gender report cards. It's one of the last two items with athletic trainers, doctors, and officials. But the real overseers, of course, are the owners, and they are overwhelmingly white, wealthy men. And that's where you can put all the rules in place to guide the hiring process. And I think the NFL has started to strengthen the Rooney Rule and put in ways. But the fact is that they have that white ownership group that the buck stops there, because some of them are not willing to take that chance or whatever it would take to have them hire a black head coach. So the pressure really has to be on the owners. We are grading the owners and the report cards and getting the access to the names really for the first time in the past couple of years, and it's made a difference in I think what we can do. But I appreciate everything. And Tracy, I have to tell you that Billy Hawkins is somebody I admire a lot, and he must be very proud. If he's your mentor, he must be very proud of who his mentee is.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And we want to hear final comments from you.
mean, this work sucks. You got to do it. You got to stay in it. White, black, like the work has been on black people and we're tired of it, right? The more white people do it, talking to white people, like that's the thing is white people need to do the work, pushing and talking to white people. Like that's where it's going to be, doing the hard, uncomfortable stuff. Like I said, don't talk to me about the work you're doing unless you're saying something to your racist aunt or uncle or grandma. It has to be in the family. You have to be willing to take a loss, to toss a table, to start an argument, right? Many white women have been conditioned to not have arguments. Like, I don't want to be disagreeable. I don't want to argue, so I'm just not going to say anything. And they're perpetuating, right, the silence that hurts Black and brown people. They have to be willing to take a stand when teaching their kids, when talking to their white spouses, their white grandparents. Like, that's a big thing is white folks doing the hard, really uncomfortable work to push this on. That's going to be because that will take the weight off of Black people having to consistently show up day in and day out, and we're exhausted.
Amen.
Anything else to say on beyond amen?
Amen. I just think a lot of what we've discussed here has just been so spot on. And while the focus today obviously has been on sports, there's so many takeaways from this that could be added to so many other aspects of our lives. And I think when Dr. Lapchick mentioned how when he was attacked, and I'm sure, as you said, there were more things that happened, it really makes you realize that actually this is a real space where change can be made. If the people didn't think that change could be made in these spaces, in these avenues, on these platforms, they wouldn't care. They would ignore you. And so I want to commend Dr. Lapchick on the work that he's done and continuing to do. And Jen, I am really excited about the work that you are doing. And I'm serious. I've never read a whole dissertation, but I feel like I would read yours. And so best of luck to you as you continue your education. And I'm just so glad that you both were able to join us today.
Well, I will say amen to that. Thank you to Jen Fry, a native of Arizona, a Division II athlete, a veteran volleyball coach with over 15 years of experience at the collegiate level, and now a social justice educator and activist around the issue of sports. And just couldn't be more grateful, Jen, for your being with us. And of course, Richard Lapchick, again, someone I've admired for a long time. I'm honored personally to have a chance to be in your presence, even though it's electronically here. So grateful to you for making the time. Professor, founder of the DeVos Sports Business Management Program, Director of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport, President of the Institute for Sport and Social Justice, co-founder of Hope for Stanley Alliance, and co-founder of Shut Out Trafficking. He doesn't have enough to do, but we thank you and we hope that you will continue to do the work in which you've been engaged. And think about passing the baton over to Jen. I know you've got great folks there at the Institute working with you. But I think you could have another partner here in Jen Fry. So, and thank you all at home for making the time to be part of the conversation and to listen in, eavesdrop in on the conversation that is taking place today around race and racism in sports. And to my co-host, thank you, Anji, for your contributions and for always being attentive and contributing to the program in very meaningful ways. Our thanks to our friends from FCTV, Debbie Rogers, the Executive Director, CEO, to Alan Russell, our production person extraordinaire, and to all who make FCTV and this show possible. So that's it for now until the next time. And remember, we might invite you to be part of the conversation on the subject at some point. Happy New Year. Bye for now.